Hey everybody, Rob here. It's time for a couple new ProRevenge stories. First one, Smart gets his digits diddled. Let's jump right in. Thank you for subscribing, and if you haven't yet, please hit that subscribe button for more daily Reddit stories. Inspired by the Sparky's Tale, where ProRevenge is exacted through skillful reprogramming of a security system, here is my tale of programmed revenge against a Smart. In a previous life, in the times when you could run a whole company with a single 12 MHz computer with 1 MB of RAM, an 80 MB hard disk, and to whom 14 users were simultaneously working through serial terminals, Windows was nothing but a fancy thing that was just a fancy thing that did nothing much beyond looking kinda fancy. Real men and women used computers with fixed-size displays that could display any colors provided they were black and yellow, or sometimes green, and computers ran DOS, which could only run one single program application at a time unless they were specially written programs. This meant that if you wanted to take some stuff from a spreadsheet into a word processor, you had to save your stuff, exit the spreadsheet, start the word processor, and import the stuff. None of that fancy schmancy cut and paste rubbish you only saw on beige toasters at the time. Once in a while, a vendor would come along with a jack-of-all-trade application that merged a lukewarm spreadsheet with a tepid word processor and hope for the best. In that particular previous life, an important department of the company used such a program to calculate quotes and present them to potential customers. As the field was very competitive, a fast turnaround time was the sine qua non. The result was that the four estimators had the biggest screamers of computer possible at the time outside of a nuclear physics lab, namely 30 MHz 80386 computers with 2 MB of RAM and 40 MB hard disks. Those were networked with RS-232 serial cables through a patch panel because to transfer the files from one estimator to another, floppies were useless because each spreadsheet file was 2 MB. With that setup, transferring a file took around 20 minutes, so often it was quicker to replicate by hand the tweaks we did to spreadsheets from one computer to the other. My job was to maintain the humongous spreadsheet, and I had to do it when the estimators were not working, because my own computer was not powerful enough to run it, and besides, I had no means of transferring the spreadsheet because my own office was at the other end of the building. Anyways, I had a good relationship with all the estimators until one retired. His replacement was an obnoxious jerk who always did better than anyone else, no matter what. Within days, everyone hated his guts, yours truly included. Back in those times of single program computers, there were a number of utilities that sat in the background until summoned by a Kabbalist combination of modifier keys that did not generate a character when pressed, but were used to modify the outcome of any other key, such as Shift, Control, Alt, or whatnot. Such a program would load, hijack the keyboard driver to spy on it to catch the Kabbalistic key combination to activate it, and then terminate but stay resident, hence the TSR moniker for such programs. Of course, writing those was a black art, which any respectable geek would see as a challenge which I accepted, and before long, writing a TSR program was second nature to me. Enter Mr. Butthole in Chief that annoyed everyone in the department. I wrote a simple program that would, upon detecting the butthole was sitting at a particular computer, would continuously scan the computer screen and, once in a while, when it spotted 4 consecutive digits, it would swap 2 of them, rinse and repeat until you detected some other user. The rate of change would increase as the day wore on. Mr. Butthole got more and more weary as the day wore on. He was continuously rechecking figures and retyping them, sending his productivity in the pits. The change only affected the screen. The data inside the program would be perfectly safe. Back then, the screen was just an area of memory you could read directly. To make things crunchier, I had installed the program on the other computers too, so Mr. Butthole could not blame the computer. Since this problem did not affect anyone else, he became increasingly irritated and was sure everyone was laughing behind his back, and soon enough, he was history. as someone else was hired to replace him. There was a bit of an argument below this story about whether it belonged in the ProRevenge subreddit or not, and one of the comments summed it up perfectly. It said, "He wrote an entire program that would recognize a specific entity back in the days when that was extremely difficult, shattered a man's confidence, probably caused insomnia, and tanked his career. That's pro in my eyes, my friend." On to our next story. Students pranked me. I had the last laugh. Let's jump right in. I spent about 10 years teaching high school humanities at a small private school. For my first 2 years, I didn't have a classroom, just a small office. I would bring what I needed for each class on a cart and go from room to room, depending on which teacher had a prep at any given time. This was incredibly inconvenient, and not being the most organized of teachers to begin with, made things difficult to keep track of. There were a group of 11th grade boys who decided to make things a little more difficult for me. They were good kids, we got along well. I coached several of them on the school soccer team, but they decided that since my office would often be empty, it was a great place to prank. It was never anything too serious, things falling over when I opened the door, or things disappearing for a day and then turning up in a different place the next day. Nothing was ever damaged, and I could never prove who it was, even though I knew. My school had mandatory final exams in each academic course. I didn't really think they were necessary, so I would generally make them pretty easy with a lot of preparation. I would give out study sheets and play review games for a couple weeks before the test, and there was no reason the students wouldn't do well on them. I had approval of admin to do this, as they weren't particularly fond of the final exam rule either. It was a school board policy. A few nights before the offending boys had their exam, I had a brainwave. I created a second exam. Gone were the multiple choice questions and obvious things from the review sheets. In their place came detailed questions about concepts that were briefly mentioned in class. Essay question after essay question, ambiguous questions with no clear answers, definitions of words that there was no way they knew. It took a couple of hours, but I laughed the whole time. When the test came, I had the special exams at the bottom of the pile and handed them out to each of the 4 or 5 boys. I told my vice principal what was happening, and he insisted on being present. I started the timer and watched as the boys flipped over their papers. It was all I could do to keep a straight face. Eyes went wide, heads were shaking, panic was setting in, especially as they saw all their classmates flying through their exams. One of the boys raised their hand. "Sorry, no questions during the final. You should be prepared based on your study sheets." I let them go for about 5 or 10 minutes of terror before I gathered the fake tests and gave them the real ones. They all passed with flying colors and never pranked my office again. It was glorious. There appears to be an even better story in the comments to this one. It says, "I had a professor in college do something similar. She held a review period after classes were over where she went over some key concepts of what would be on the exam at the end of the semester. She was horrified that only 4 of her 28 students showed up, as she knew that the students that didn't show up were some of the ones that needed a lot of help. She told us 4 students at the end of the exam period she highly recommended we read the instructions on the front page very carefully. The day of the exam came and she passed out a packet of papers. This exam looked beastly. It had at least 15 pages of organic chemistry problems on it. She told us that we had 30 minutes to complete this exam. Knowing that only 4 of us showed up to the review, she knew the rest of the class would just scramble to answer all the problems and not read the instructions. The instructions were 3 sentences, and at first glance it looked like the generic read each question carefully and either bubble in your answer if multiple choice or clearly write out the flow of the reaction, etc., etc. The last sentence instructed us to flip to the back page and only complete what was on that page. The back page was the easiest 10 or so questions she'd given us all year, and the last question asked us to draw our favorite animal and that the best artist would get an additional 2 points added to our final grade for the entire class. It was hilarious to see the other students freak out that a couple of us had already started turning in our papers after the 15-minute mark. I've heard a similar story to this one before, but I don't think as a teacher that I would have waited until the exam to bring this out. This is probably a test I would have given them really early in the year, so that they would remember to check the instructions on all of the tests going forward through the rest of the school year. I want to thank both OPs for posting their stories to the ProRevenge subreddit. You can visit them at the links in the description below. Please go there and give them an upvote. Once again, this is Rob from Karma Comment Chameleon saying thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please hit that subscribe button, drop a like, and share it with your friends. And we'll see you in the next one.